Now, if you're on your way to hell, if you're an unbeliever, you've served your time in this world and had probably not as much fun as you'd like to think you've had, and you're going to suffer for it eternally, and there won't be any talk of change in hell. There won't be a chance to mend your ways or to ask for Christ's forgiveness or any of those things in hell. You'll just suffer, and that's just and it's fair. And even though you'll lament it, and even though you'll rue the fact that it's you and not someone else, you'll also know that you are deserving of such punishment. So these are life and death things we're talking about today. If you don't recognize that yet in your life, perhaps following through Pilgrims Progress you will. Because when the book begins, Bunyan's character, a man who has no name when the book begins, who will soon have a name, we'll call him Christian, by about the third or fourth page, he's troubled. And before we extend to the story, I'd like to give you a little bit more background on Bunyan's personal life so that you can come to appreciate how God uses men of every rank and of every origin and uses them for his own purposes. In this case, John Bunyan, from a meager beginning to a great man who wrote this, I will tell you, while he was in prison. This allegory of his that has changed so many lives by God's grace. He wrote it during a stay or two in prison, and he will end up serving somewhere more than 12 years in prison during 2 different imprisonments, and he will serve it because he's guilty of meeting without a license with other Christians. He's guilty of being a nonconformist in an England that demands that you be part of the Church of England. And he could have quit preaching, but he wouldn't be silenced. And so they imprisoned him. And God wanted him to be in prison, didn't he? So that he could write this wonderful allegory which would have an effect on so many people. You know, John and I were just talking. This is the book that I'm using. It's called Pilgrims Progress by John Bunyan. If you have the opportunity, please go out and buy one so that you can follow along as I go through here, because it's well worth whatever this costs, and this one cost $8.95. You can find it in various bookstores. It's called Pilgrims Progress. Any Christian bookstore may or may not have it, because Christian bookstores today are sort of lame in the main, no offense. But any normal bookstore will even have it. It's such a famous book. Now, if you don't want to go get a book, if you will go online, at the end of this show, John will put up a website where you can go right online and print out a version of Pilgrims Progress so that you can have your own version right online. Now, if you can't do that or don't want to do that, but you still wish to have a copy, just call me at 217-652-3525. Just call me, and I'll make sure you get one. Or email me, at the email that's on the screen, wmdmoore@hotmail.com, and I will make sure that you get a copy, because I want you to have one so you can read ahead of me, and then when I explain it, you'll understand it a little better. Okay? So let's try to work that out. At the beginning of the book, Bunyan, remember, as I told you in the last part, he's really in prison writing this book. But he writes what he calls the author's apology for this book, because when he started this little project, he had no idea if it would be well received or ill received. He was just some guy, a tinker in fact, a very uneducated man trying to do what he could for Christ's cause while he was in prison. And here's one of the lines he uses in here. And thus it was, I, writing of the way and race of saints in our gospel day, fell suddenly into an allegory about their journey and the way to glory. That's very typical of the way he writes. And he'll come to another section in this little apology where he says, when he's done with it, he tried to show it to some friends to see if he should try to publish it or not. And they said to him, he says this, I showed them others that I might see whether they would condemn them or justify. And some said, let them live. Some said, let them die. Some said, John, print it. Others said, not so. Some said it might do good. Others said, no. No. So he was caught between, so he goes on and says, well, I couldn't tell. Half of them seemed to like it. Half of them seemed to think it was a bad idea. I thought, who can be hurt by it? So he kind of gets near the end of this little apology, and he says, if you follow this book, it shows you how he runs and runs till he unto the gate of glory comes. It shows you, too, who set out for life amain, as if the lasting crown they would obtain. Here also you may see the reason why they lose their labor like fools do die. This book will make a traveler of thee, if by its counsel thou wilt ruled be. It will directly to the Holy Land, if thou wilt its directions understand. Yea, it will make the slothful active be, the blind also delightful things to see. And then he comes to this last part and he says, then read my fancies, they will stick like burrs. And that's exactly what I've found about Pilgrims Progress, is that when I tell you how this story evolves and the characters he runs across, whether they're giants or dragons or bears or whatever troubles he runs into, I need for you to understand that it's exciting to people. And if you're a Christian, it explains to people very much the Christian experience. The people he runs into in the church, Mr. Worldly Wise and Mr. Self-Righteous and all of these characters, are all people that you sit in pews next to. Simple and slothful and presumption. They're all people you know, as well as Mercy and Mr. Valiant for the Truth and the Interpreter and the Enchanted Ground. They're all places in the Giant's Caves. All these things are very well written and very truthful about the people that you're going through life with on your pilgrimage. Because remember, the secret to this understanding is that each and every one of you, as well as Bill Moore, is on a pilgrimage. So with that, I'm going to give you a little bit more background on Bunyan, and we'll get right to the story. Okay, a little more background on our buddy John Bunyan. Pilgrims Progress, born 1628, really just in a little village about a mile from Bedford, England. He was a tinker and a brazier, as his father was. And what a tinker and a brazier do is, if your frying pan has a hole in it, needs mending, you bring it to the brazier, and he mends those kind of utensils and straightens them out and does these kinds of things. And if you're a tinker, you really do a little bit of everything around the village. And that's kind of what John did, as his father did. His name was Thomas before him. He had 2 to 4 years of schooling, although later on in his autobiography he'll say he almost forgot to read, how to read at a point in his life. He was too busy doing wicked things, and he just didn't use it, and he almost lost the ability to read, which just shows you the grace of God in making this man into an author. He gets married in 1649, but prior to that, he writes an autobiography later in his life called Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. And in it, he mentions what he was like as a boy, and I want you to get this straight from him. As a boy, he said, I had few equals for cursing, swearing, lying, and blaspheming the holy name of God. I had dreams of devils and wicked spirits coming to take me away. I wished to be a devil, he said, because I thought there were only tormentors and tormented, and he didn't want to be the tormented. He believed in that, so he wanted to be one of the tormentors. He had a miserable life. In fact, he suffered from melancholy for a great deal of his life, and from a sort of what seems like a sort of a depression by nature. Now, during that period of his lying, swearing, and actually at one point he says 2 other sins he committed. One was dancing in his mind, and the second was bell ringing. Now, I don't know what bell ringing is as a sin. Maybe it's out of season bell ringing, or maybe it's, just sort of being a rascal about it. I don't know what happens, but I'm just telling you what he said. So he lives a terrible life, and then he starts going to church, and he gets sort of interested in, and then of course the first thing that happens when you get sort of interested in Christianity and fitting in is that you end up being self-righteous and being hypocritical. You don't get converted. Going to church doesn't make you a Christian. You understand that. There are a lot of non-Christians who attend church. It's a matter of the heart. not a matter of getting your hiney in that pew, although some people don't recognize that. But he ends up being such a terrible swearer that he's an annoying person to everybody around him, even his friends, as it's related. And so by 1649, he gets married to a woman called Pious Mary. Well, that tells you something about her character. She's so poor, as John is, that she only has a dowry that contains 2 items. And her dowry contains these 2 items, 2 books. Now, in God's providence, because John is going to be moved to follow him, what 2 books do you suppose that she possesses from her father? One of them's called The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven by Arthur Dent, which you can still get. It's in print today. The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven. And the second one's called The Practice of Piety. If you can imagine, that's all she brought into the marriage, and it's the very things that God used to convert this man. She spoke often glowingly, the wife did, of her father and his pious life, and John was greatly affected by that, enough to go to church. So marriage was a very good thing for him to come to. Now, by 1649, he's converted. If you'll notice, and he writes this autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. But you notice there's a gap. Most of the sections in Pilgrims Progress are going to refer to this gap in his life, because it doesn't follow his life exactly, but it follows his life closely. And when you see his personal life, you'll realize why he writes this book the way he does and discusses the events in this character's life the way he does, because it's really from his heart. It was what he experienced when he felt the conviction of God about the truth of things. But I want you to remember that during his first visits to the church, he's not only a hypocrite, he's a self-righteous hypocrite. At one point he says he went to church twice a day. He was so convinced of what a good man he was that he thought no man in England pleased God more than he did. Well, later on, it would only add to his conviction when he realized how odious it is, this idea that he could be self-righteous and in God's eyes be a wonderful thing. He saw that God would not tolerate it in him. 1660, he'll go to prison, as I said before, and after about 3 months, it seems that they let him out, but he wouldn't desist from preaching the gospel every opportunity he had, and he got good results. They put him back in prison, and the 3 months turned into 12 years. He gets out after 12 years, and then he goes back in for 6 months 2 years later, and that's the end of his imprisonment. During these imprisonments, he writes this wonderful book, Pilgrims Progress. Now, we're at the end of our time for today. Try to get a copy of this book so that you can read ahead. Just read the first 10 pages or so, and you'll catch up with us on these ensuing weeks. If you can't get it, email me, call me, I'll get you one. Please do this. This is worthwhile, and this will be something that will stick with you the rest of your days. Thanks.